Obviously now, again, for full disclosure, I did actually give almost exactly the same presentation this morning to almost an entirely sleep physician audience at my old research institute at the Woolcock in Sydney. And so I do sort of have both concussion and sleep-related slides. And so the concussion stuff, I'm hoping I can sort of just skip over for the sake of timing. We know that a concussion is caused by, some kind of traumatic injury to the brain, be it a direct impact, acceleration, deceleration, or counter coup, as they like to say, or even a blast injury. And concussion really is damage to the neurons. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a little laser pointer on me, so I can't sort of highlight it. But it's where the axons become stretched, torn, or ruptured. And that causes essentially a neurochemical cascade, which alters the functioning, the metabolism of the axons and various other structures around it. The symptoms, I'm sure most of you know, only about 20% lose consciousness, but, there's loss of memory, neurocognitive deficits, even balance problems. And in fact, the first ever concussion that I had to deal with, we had a player trashing up a room. He got really aggressive, really angry, and then 10 minutes later was in a sort of ball crying in the corner. So it's quite interesting just from my own experiences just to see the different sort of symptoms that do and the different sort of outcomes of concussion that occur. The diagnosis or the identification of concussion, personally, I think is a bit wanting, hence my involvement in what I do now. A lot of sports around the world, they rely on screening tools such as the Sports Concussion Assessment Tool, and this identifies, the symptoms and measures basic neurocognitive performance. Imaging has minimal use. MRIs can bring up cerebral bleeds, little microbleeds. Positron emission tomography has some use in identifying sort of more chronic ongoing damage from concussion or brain injury. But the problem is that most of the imaging that we have does not bring up that sort of cellular level damage that occurs to the axons. This was sort of put in for my sleep physician colleagues, and I have highlighted the single question of trouble falling asleep. And I'll explain why that's important in a number of slides' time. But this is part of the Sports Concussion Assessment Tool. You have a range of different symptoms and a range of neurocognitive performance, and there's also a balanced performance. I did mention chronic traumatic encephalopathy at the start. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of debate as to the link between sort of concussion and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's caused by an accumulation of amyloid beta and tau protein plaques within the brain. The symptoms of CTE is memory loss, dementia, Parkinsonism, mental health issues, impulse control and aggression. Unfortunately, as it stands, the only formal diagnosis is post-mortem, although, as I said, the PET imaging may actually provide some insight with that. And look, sadly, it has been in the media of late. In this first news article here, Shane Tuck was an Australian rules footballer who sadly committed suicide. Dave Watson was a Premier League footballer in the UK, and indeed the NFL has been, had many cases of CTE. And there was the study that was published in 2017, which showed that 111 of the 112 brains that have been donated from former professional NFL players had evidence of CTE. And that indeed, high school players were showing signs of CTE. So it sort of shows how this sort of neurodegenerative process can start early. As I said, there's been debate about sort of the link between concussion and CTE. On the one side, I sort of highlighted them in blue, you do have studies and research suggesting that there is a direct link between the two, given that high school students and the reason why they managed to do an autopsy is that they sadly died of a completely unrelated incident, say for example a car accident. But the fact that those brains are showing signs of damage already does strongly indicate that there is a direct link between concussion and CTE. On the other hand, though, there is research showing that other lifestyle factors also contribute to this progression of CTE. And that's really where my talk comes in, is that we know that sleep is an important part of neurodegeneration. We do know that after a severe traumatic brain injury, so be it a motor vehicle accident or a worksite accident, there are ongoing long-term sleep disturbances, insomnia-like, trouble falling asleep, very poor quality sleep. And so we already know that this is a big area with major TBIs. But my interest was more in the concussion space, bearing in mind that many of these studies occur in a hospital setting. They're often recruited from people admitted to hospital. And so they're obviously quite severe, but I've yet to actually have any concussion, particularly with an adult population where they go to hospital. And so, I do believe that there was and is a gap in the literature and a gap in the research. Just focusing on sleep for a little bit now, is I did give quite an extensive talk on sleep back in 2017 at Aspetar, and ironically that was after coming off a 15-hour flight. I'd hope the audience knew that we sort of need 7 to 8 hours a night, and for athletes, good sleep means improved athletic performance, reduced injury risk. Sadly, we do know that sleep disturbances are very prevalent in athletes. For example, Juliff's paper, which was looking at Australian Institute of Sport athletes, showed that 15% of them were on some form of medication that was prescribed not by a sleep physician. It was just prescribed by so that meant that there was no sort of clinical examination as to why there were these sleep problems. We know that athletes do suffer from a number of behavioural and environmental concerns. The stress of just performing, training and playing at odd hours. We've got swimmers and rowers up at 4 a.m. in the morning. The recent Australian Open final ended about 2 a.m. in the morning in Melbourne. And combined with that one, the lighting. The lighting seems to sit right in the middle of the blue light spectrum, which is very disruptive to sleep. I've seen players down, a entire can of caffeinated beverage at half time at sort of 9 o'clock at night. And up until recently, there was a lot of travel. You look at the Super Rugby competition, they were traveling between South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So they're traveling across about 14 time zones. We do also know that there's a lot of insomnia in athletes. And we also know that in sports such as rugby and NFL, where you may need a bigger neck, that this actually leads to obstructive sleep apnea. And in particular, after they've retired, the rates of obstructive sleep apnea skyrocket. And the reason that's important is with sleep apnea, you're essentially choking yourself during sleep, and you actually have reduced oxygen delivery to the brain, which, separate to any concussion in itself, very sort of dangerous and can cause some long-term neurological problems. The health consequences of disordered sleep is, memory and attention problems, ability to think. There's a strong link between mental health, and not so much at athlete level, but there's also strong cardiometabolic outcomes as well, diabetes, high blood pressure. Although, with that said, I have noticed there's been a large increase in the concern about cardiac-related issues in athletes, and I just wonder whether or not there's a link with sleep in there. But that's for another presentation. Ultimately, sleep disturbances are a primary risk for a range of neurodegenerative disorders, and that has been sort of proven beyond doubt. And so really a lot of the research is now going beyond that and trying to see how addressing these sleep disturbances can either at least halt or even potentially reduce the neurodegenerative process. Now, look, this next slide, I do apologize, it's a bit busy, but I wanted to get it all onto the one slide. Neurodegeneration, it's caused, and I use that term probably incorrectly, so I do apologise. But it's caused by the buildup of amyloid beta and tau protein plaques. Slow wave sleep, and I've put in there delta activity because that sort of relates more to the waveform itself as opposed to the stage of sleep. But this slow wave, the slow wave sleep, it activates what's known as the lymphatic process, which essentially cleans the brain. And in particular, they've shown removes amyloid beta and tau protein. And I'll show a study which sort of provided proof of that. This sort of little animation here, this was actually quite now a very famous study conducted back in 2019, where they had people essentially fall asleep inside an MRI. They put trace markers into the bloodstream, and they showed that at the peak of the slow waves, and so there's these big sort of high amplitude, low frequency waves, it was like a pulsatile cleaning of the brain. And essentially, the slower the wave, the stronger that pulse was. And so essentially, the more cleaning you got within the brain. Slow wave sleep, and therefore which accounts for predominantly delta activity. It's about a quarter of your sleep, but it does occur predominantly at the start of your sleep, whereas REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, occurs at the end. Now that's important because if you're getting to bed at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, often due to an interaction of the melatonin and cortisol and other sort of hormones in your system at the time, you actually often miss the slow wave sleep and you tend to go into REM sleep relatively quickly. And so that's important. Ultimately, the disruption of slow wave sleep does reduce the lymphatic process, and it does lead to an accumulation of amyloid beta and tau protein. The study on the left-hand side, again, quite famous now. They simply deprived one group of males a night's sleep, and then another group allowed them to sleep whenever they wanted to and however long they wanted to. And they showed that in the group that were allowed to sleep, and they had healthy sleep, there was no sort of sleep disturbances or anything, there was a 6% reduction in amyloid precursor, there you go, beta amyloids and the amyloid precursor proteins. Whereas the group that were sleep deprived did not experience this reduction in amyloid beta. And so while 6% may seem like not a lot, when you start to accumulate that night after night after night, that's going to start to build up. The other important aspect is that they have shown that the amyloid beta and tau proteins, they themselves can actually interfere and disrupt with your sleep. And so it becomes almost a form of a vicious cycle. You have poor sleep, you accumulate these plaques, that then causes you to have even poorer sleep, which causes more accumulation, so on and so forth. And so it did lead to my overall question that's sort of been guiding a lot of my research, and I'm still involved with it. Although sadly, a lot of that funding that Louis mentioned was awarded right at the end of 2019. So great time to receive funding. But is chronic traumatic encephalopathy mediated by sleep disturbances? So when it came to creating this presentation, I was unsure of how to exactly set it out, because there's two real parts. There's the effect of concussion on sleep, and then the effect of sleep on concussion. And so instead, I actually thought I would simply just present the research that's either I've come across or I've undertaken in a chronological fashion. So the first study I'm going to present was from Morolska and colleagues out of Zurich. Now, at the time, I was in the middle of a study looking at sleep and stroke. And I was giving a presentation to the hospital I was working at, the old repatriation hospital in Adelaide. Now that was it was a hospital where a lot of soldiers were sent. And one of the neurologists just asked me, had I looked at traumatic brain injury? They were getting soldiers coming back who had sort of these blast injuries, and a lot of them were having sleep problems. And I remember that night I came across a news article of one of the Australian League players who went over to try and make in the NFL, complaining that the tackles are so hard he was having trouble sleeping. And then literally the next morning after both those conversations, this paper came up in the RSS feed. And so it was a bit sort of serendipitous that this occurred. So in this paper, the researchers got 50 Sprague Dawley rats, and they sort of separated them into a traumatic brain injury group and a sham group. Now, in the previous presentation, I did actually have a cartoon of what the weight drop model looked like, and that actually horrified quite a few people. So I've removed it. But basically, this poor rat gets strapped down. They put a funnel on top of its head, and they drop, a weight. And I think it was the equivalent of about 50 kilos of what would be 50 kilos to a human head. So, certainly something that would cause a fair amount of injury. There were 3 interventions, and this lasted for 2 weeks. So there was, the no intervention. There was then sleep induction, and this was done pharmacologically by sodium oxybate. And then the sleep restriction, which causes rebound slow wave sleep. So, some of you have maybe had, a overnight shift or whatever. When you sort of do eventually get to sleep, you realize you have this really deep sleep and this really sort of almost quite refreshing sleep. And that's what happens when you have sleep restrictions. A bit paradoxical in that regard. Put simply, the sleep interventions improved recovery, both cognitively and neurologically. So look, over the top sort of figures was the delta waves. So I sort of mentioned that this occurs prominently during slow wave sleep, but the sleep induction and sleep restriction did lead to quite a large increase in delta wave activity, and therefore this is what sort of stimulates this glymphatic process. The bar graph below, that is sort of the gold standard cognitive test for animal studies. It's the recognition test. And so at baseline, which is the black bar, all the rats were sort of well above chance level, which means, they had sort of learned to recognize the objects. The only group after the 2 weeks that was not above chance level was the TBI control group. The rest of them, the sham group, unsurprisingly, they did not have a brain injury. And indeed, the 2 sleep intervention groups in the TBI group, they were still well above significant level, chance levels. And so, their cognitive performance was essentially maintained. What was really telling, however, was the sort of histological analysis of the brain. Now, I don't pretend that I know all that much about what these slides are showing. I had a colleague who specializes in animal studies sort of help me with this one. But essentially, the more green, the worse the outcome. And so what we can see here is in the left-hand sort of figures, the TBI control groups, here we are, I think you can see my mouse. You can see they're very green. And so this was amyloid precursor proteins. So this is what leads to amyloid beta. And you can see that there is a large accumulation in the cortex and hippocampus in the TBI control group. The other groups, sham, and then the 2 sleep intervention groups, not as much green. Yes, there is some, obviously there is a little bit, but certainly nowhere near the TBI control. And look, these graphs essentially are just a graphical representation of that, is that the TBI control groups had these large increases compared to the other groups of the APP. So to me, this study did sort of confirm that there is definitely a link between sleep and TBI, and that sleep could potentially be used as a essentially a treatment, for the want of a better expression or better term, for TBI. But my one criticism is that they didn't actually go and analyze the changes in sleep, or what we call macroarchitecture, between, say, the sham and the TBI control group. So they didn't look at if there was any changes in, say, slow wave sleep, or if there was changes in total sleep time. And I thought there was a real missed opportunity. And so, yeah, it encouraged me to go after, and pursue sort of a research in this area. And so, look, as with most new areas of research, you do a review. And so myself and Louis and a range of other investigators, we undertook a scoping review of the literature. We used prospective and retrospective. I did keep it to over 18 years only because adolescent sleep, it's different again. And so we sort of would have muddied the waters. But we kept it very broad. We wanted as many papers as possible, and yet we only sort of ended up with 10. If I was to put in any papers that did look at sort of, say, 10 to 18-year-olds, I think that would have bumped up to about 13. So there's really not a lot of research in this area. 9 of the studies looked at subjective changes via some form of questionnaire. And we did try to pull them. It was difficult to pull them because there was very little homogeneity between the study designs. For example, only 3 of the studies used validated sleep questionnaires. But look, a third of the studies, or at least a third of the participants within these studies, seem to report worse sleep or poorer sleep or, shorter sleep. About 1/3 reported no real changes in sleep, and then about 1/3 reported sort of better or longer sleep. Of interest, the one study that did not show any changes in sleep used the sports concussion assessment tool. That's why I highlighted that question in red, because the question asked trouble falling asleep, which means you miss out on a whole plethora of people who maybe are sleeping much longer, which other concussion assessment tools do ask. Of the studies that objectively measured sleep, so 2 of them used actigraphy. So that's this little watch, a glorified Fitbit, for the want of a better term. They didn't show any changes between the concussed and non-concussed group. Now, one of them used a pre-post design, which was quite well done. Another one just used sort of a concussed and non-concussed group. But they did show that within the concussed group, there was a large coefficient of variation of the results. And so it does suggest that, again, there is a variability in what happens to sleep. There was another study that looked at polysomnography, so that's putting the wires on and checking the brain waves in 8 concussed versus 10 controls. And they did show no differences in PSG measures between the concussed group and the control group. Now, my criticism or my concern with that result, however, is that there was between 1 to 11 months between when the concussion occurred and when the sleep study occurred. And so the damage to the brain and the recovery to the brain, you cannot control over that period of time. And so, my concern with that one is that there was people who had an injury 12 months ago could very well have completely recovered, and any sleep problems that may be present that occurred, say, acutely, were gone. There was a difference in the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index questionnaire. Those who had concussion did report worse quality of sleep. But again, my real interest is looking at that objective brainwave sort of measurement of sleep. And so it sort of culminated in this study here, which, as I said, I received funding at the end of 2019. The aim that I would tap into the 2020 collision sports season, which ended up being severely hampered. The aim was to examine, sleep via electroencephalography acutely within 7 days, and then again 8 weeks later. This was in lieu of trying to get preseason baseline sleep, just because there was any, it was difficult. So look, yeah, the aim was to measure sleep acutely and after 8 weeks, and then this was in lieu of trying to do any sort of baseline measures prior to a concussion, because you'd need to do an entire sporting competition, really. But look, unfortunately, it's this inherent weakness that's very difficult to overcome. The results are sort of tabled here. Now, I did have a hypothesis that slow wave sleep may be altered. And unfortunately, it hardly any alteration in the composition of slow wave sleep whatsoever. REM sleep increased. So sort of pre. That's actually the wrong term. I should not have used that. It should be acute and subacute. That's just force of habit from other research that I've been doing where I do pre and post. But what was sort of really interesting is that sleep efficiency improved. So what that means is that compared to the acute within 7 days measure, sleep 8 weeks afterwards, the person was essentially sleeping longer. They weren't waking up as many times throughout the night, and they weren't spending much of their nights awake. The other really interesting result was the changes in the onset to slow wave sleep and the onset to REM sleep. So in the acute post-concussion period, it was taking sort of twice as long to fall into slow wave sleep than it was at sort of the 8-week mark. Now, the hypothesis, and speaking with colleagues about this, is they think that may actually be an interaction between the neurochemical cascade that just occurs naturally with sleep, which takes you from stage 1 to stage 2, then to 3, and then to REM, and then the neurochemical cascade that occurs with a concussion. And so, we've actually done a quick look into it. Bearing in mind this was only sort of scored in the past 2 weeks. We only sort of just managed to get around to doing it. But there does appear to be that some of the neurochemicals that are released in a concussion actually essentially are agonists to, or antagonists, sorry, to a lot of the neurochemicals required for sleep. And so that's why we think that this may be explain these results. But then ultimately it didn't actually affect how much slow wave sleep or REM sleep the person got. But it's certainly something worth exploring a bit more, and may explain why in more severe cases we still see problems with sleep. So look, the other interesting, I didn't present the numbers here, but there was a small but significant increase in heart rate after 8 weeks. I would have expected the opposite. I would have thought after an injury with potentially sort of cortisol and inflammatory markers that heart rate would be higher in the acute phase, but it wasn't. And we also showed that there was an increase in oxygen desaturation index, so as in how many times you sort of starve the brain of oxygen after in the acute phase compared to sort of the subacute phase, but they were very low numbers anyway, so it's probably more just it's probably irrelevant. Look, as I said, there were a number of weaknesses. I tried doing this during a COVID pandemic. It was very difficult, so we only got 10 participants. They were relatively mild as well. I think the most sort of severe in terms of symptomology had 8 symptoms ticked on the SCAT questionnaire and a combined score of about 34. So quite mild. As I said, there was no baseline, and we didn't have a control group. We were aiming to, but with COVID going around, we were quite hamstrung with what we could do. And look, the other thing as well is we didn't really have much in the way of other data to correlate against, and that's important because whilst total sleep time, the change itself wasn't significant, they have shown that sort of 15, 20-minute changes in total sleep time does actually lead to sort of improvements in athletic performance and improvements in cognitive performance. And so it might be that there is actually a bit of correlation between some of these changes. The last point I'm going to make is that scoring of sleep studies is actually not good. It's scored in 30-second epochs, and if 16 seconds of your epoch is, say, stage 3, and then 14 seconds is stage 2, then that entire 30 seconds is scored as stage 3. And so it's not precise. There is a technique known as spectral analysis, which can actually really analyzes all the little waveforms within a PSG, and so it may actually shed a bit more light on what's happening to sleep in this sort of acute and then subacute concussion. And look, the last thing as well is that I put this sort of picture on here. Sleep studies can be uncomfortable. You got wires hanging off you, and it can it has the potential to interfere with sleep. Now, the fact that sleep onset was relatively unchanged means I think we avoided that, but it's something that we've always got to keep a mind of. And so, look, that was sort of the research that Louis and I got funded for, and I am still continuing it on. And in the last slide, I'll explain how I'm going to sort of adapt this to try and, I guess, increase numbers and improve, I guess, the overall sort of the outcomes that we can get. But whilst I was doing sort of this and planning for this study, it then brought attention into what I feel is possibly a shortcoming of the current concussion assessment tools. So Rakes and colleagues in 2019, they published this paper showing that athletes that reported either pre-season insomnia or pre-season excessive daytime sleepiness had significantly higher risk of sustaining a concussion. But then when you look at the symptoms and indeed the tests that are used to identify a concussion, they are susceptible to sleepiness. So I bring this slide back up. Every one of these symptoms, if they haven't already, I could write a systematic review on how sleep affects it. Even the stage of the balance testing. I mean, that was actually one of my research areas. I've written 2 separate reviews showing how sleep deprivation and clinical sleep disorders affects your balance and actually increases your chance of having a fall, which when you're elderly is obviously quite a severe issue. Neurocognitive outcomes are central to a lot of what we do in sleep research, and we will do a battery of neurocognitive tests similar to word recall, digit backwards, etc., to see the effect of the sleep deprivation or indeed of a clinical sleep disorder. And so the letter that myself and Louis and colleagues wrote, we did sort of publicly question, are we possibly detecting just daytime sleepiness? Are we just detecting if a person had really poor sleep? Or is there indeed, does daytime sleepiness and do any potential sleep disturbances actually increase the risk of injuring the brain itself? And does it increase the severity of injuring the brain? Further evidence of this was published last year. It's a big consortium study out of the United States, but in roughly 30,000 young adults, so sort of athletes and cadets, all of whom had no previous TBI, no previous concussion. There was evidence of post-concussion syndrome according to the ICD-10. And for the case of the cadets, the third largest association with experiencing post-concussion syndrome, despite never having had a concussion before, was short sleep duration. The first one was base location, and the second one was age. And for athletes, the largest association was short sleep duration. So there was sort of this growing evidence that having these underlying sleep problems does actually muddy the waters a bit when it comes to concussion. But concerningly, with the SCAT test, they only simply ask trouble falling asleep. And so I'm sort of going to finish off on this study here. Now, this was done between myself, Louis, and Rena Grant from the University of Pretoria, as well as Louis. I'll let you say the name of the sports doctors. They just escape me at the moment. But we had access now. I know I said in my scoping review I didn't want to go near adolescent athletes, but we actually had access to de-identified, essentially audited baseline screening of adolescent athletes within the Pretoria region, and we managed to sort of classify them as experiencing sleep problems based off the answer to the question number 13 on the table, their drowsiness. Now, for some reason, a baseline, they cut it off at number 16. So 17 to 24 was not included in the baseline questionnaire, but then after a concussion, it was. And look, for completion's sake, we also looked at baseline emotional disturbances as well. And of the 292 concussions, and it was interesting, a journal editor said that number looked a bit high. And so our response was, well, that's what you get when you have proper surveillance of injuries. Concussion, for those who reported sleep problems or sort of drowsiness at baseline, they were 2.6 times more likely to experience a concussion, and that it was associated with sort of about half of the concussion symptoms. And now this is in model 1. Again, with those who reported emotional disturbances, similar numbers with the concussion risk, but it was associated with an even greater number of concussion symptoms. And so, put simply, I mean, we showed it in an adolescent population, and I have no doubt that if we were to look at it with an adult population, that these sleep and emotional disturbances would increase the risk of concussion and increase the symptomology. And so, look, I'm going to end it. This is sort of my summary slide. There wasn't a lot, as I said. It's an area that's relatively within its infancy. We know sleep's important for neural health when we know that poor sleep is prevalent within athletes, and I think that needs to be now front and center for a lot of, screening and a lot of concerns around athlete health. There is preliminary evidence to suggest that sleep is affected by concussion. And at the same time, that sleep affects the outcomes of potential concussion. And this has implications for recovery. It also may have potential implications for return to play decisions. But it really sort of, to me, confirms that we need to be a bit more vigilant with sleep problems, and dare I say mental health as well, at both the pre-season but as well post-concussion monitoring. With that said, though, a lot more needs to be done. We need to measure actigraphy. Now, I've put these little pictures over on the side. These are new platforms on the market that can measure EEG portably. So you've got the headband, and then the white one. This looks like an oversized bandage that you stick onto your forehead. But both have been shown to be very sort of accurate at measuring sleep and sleep stages. And I think the implementation of these technologies would alleviate a lot of the problems. For example, you can't do baseline testing, or players are concerned about doing a sleep study after a head injury. It would also allow for research into larger and more diverse cohorts, and so we know that women are far more likely to be concussed, and yet the majority of research only examines male athletes. And then it can be implemented as part of this push within the concussion field to have sort of physiological measures of concussion and sort of move beyond just the sort of questionnaire. We do know that, for example, cerebral blood flow continually reduces up to about a month after a concussion. And so a lot of sports that I've dealt with, they sort of have this arbitrary sort of day number. You should have this time off, and then if you're feeling okay, you can go back on, or at least to contact training. But I think there needs to be a push towards having more physiological measurements, which I think these sleep can do. So thank you.